For most of a century, Asbury Park was one of the most famous boardwalks in America. A mile of amusement piers, grand hotels, and a beachfront so busy in summer that its population swelled from 17,000 to 80,000 almost overnight. Then, on the 4th of July, 1970, it nearly burned to the ground. What followed wasn't a slow fade. Within a few years, the boardwalk that had once rivaled Atlantic City sat half empty. Grand hotels closed their doors. The amusement park that gave this town its most famous symbol, a grinning painted face named Tilly, was eventually torn down altogether. By the 1980s, driving through Asbury Park after dark meant driving past block after block of boarded windows. And most New Jersey families who'd vacationed here for generations simply stopped coming. This is the story of how Asbury Park rose, how it nearly disappeared completely, and why even now, nobody's quite sure whether it's finished disappearing or just getting started again. Chapter 1: The Minister's Rules. Asbury Park did not happen by accident, and it did not happen slowly. It happened because one man, in 1871, decided exactly what kind of town he wanted to build, and then built it. His name was James A. Bradley, a brush manufacturer from New York City who had made his money selling paintbrushes, not real estate. But Bradley had a vision, and it wasn't primarily commercial, at least not at first. He bought a stretch of undeveloped New Jersey coastline and named it after Francis Asbury, the first bishop of the Methodist Episcopal Church in America. This wasn't a resort town founded by a hotelier chasing profit. It was founded in large part by a man with a moral project in mind, someone who genuinely believed a seaside town could be built around discipline as much as leisure, and who saw no contradiction between running a business and running something closer to a moral experiment. Bradley's Asbury Park had rules, and he enforced them seriously. No alcohol was sold within the town limits. Profanity in public could get you fined. Bradley personally patrolled the boardwalk at times, correcting behavior he considered improper, the way a stern parent might supervise a family picnic. He wanted a seaside town that respectable families could visit without encountering the vice and rowdiness associated with other coastal resorts of the era, places where drinking, gambling, and looser social mores had already taken hold. It was, in a real sense, a town built on control and restraint, a place where fun was meant to be wholesome, supervised, and quiet by 10 o'clock, every single night, all summer long. Bradley wasn't just a moralist either. He was also a genuinely effective town builder, laying out streets, installing early infrastructure, and allowing the Atlantic Coast Electric Company to bring electric service into the town, even though he personally preferred the older gas lighting he'd grown up with. He understood that a resort town needed real, functioning infrastructure underneath its moral architecture if it was going to survive and grow. And he built accordingly. Hold on to that detail because it matters later. A town founded on rigid moral rules would, within a single century, become known for something almost entirely opposite: smoky nightclubs, all-night jam sessions, and a raw, unpolished rock and roll scene that helped launch one of the most celebrated musicians in American history. The distance between what Bradley intended and what Asbury Park actually became is, in many ways, the whole story of this town. And it's a distance worth keeping in mind as we work through everything that happened in between. Chapter 2: Building an Empire of Leisure. Bradley didn't stop at rules. He built infrastructure, and it's the infrastructure that turned Asbury Park from a moral experiment into a genuine resort empire. Along the waterfront, he installed a proper boardwalk, an orchestra pavilion where bands could perform for strolling visitors, public changing rooms for beachgoers, and a pier extending out over the water at the boardwalk's southern end. This wasn't a modest effort. It was a serious, sustained investment in making Asbury Park a destination rather than just a beach. That investment attracted other businessmen who saw the same opportunity Bradley had, each one betting that the town's growing reputation would keep drawing crowds year after year. In 1888, an entrepreneur named Ernest Schnitzler built a merry-go-round on the southwest corner of Lake Avenue and Kingsley Street. It was modest at first, but it became the seed of something much larger. Over the following decades, that corner grew into the Palace Amusements complex, an indoor arcade and entertainment center that would eventually become one of the most recognizable landmarks on the entire boardwalk. Convention Hall followed, an enormous, architecturally serious building meant to host everything from political conventions to concerts to civic gatherings. Alongside it, a grand casino building anchored the southern end of the boardwalk, its name referring to the old sense of the word, a public entertainment hall, not a gambling house, in keeping with Bradley's original moral vision. Grand hotels rose along the nearby streets, built to house the growing crowds of summer visitors, some of them genuinely impressive structures with wide verandas and ocean views, built to compete with the finest resort hotels anywhere on the East Coast. By the early 20th century, Asbury Park's boardwalk stretched over a mile, lined with amusements, restaurants, and shops, drawing comparisons to Atlantic City itself, the undisputed king of Jersey Shore resort towns at the time. Asbury Park never quite matched Atlantic City's scale, but it carved out a genuine identity of its own. Slightly smaller, slightly more restrained, but architecturally serious in a way that gave it real staying power as a destination. Visitors arriving by train from New York could step off the platform and walk directly onto a boardwalk that felt, by the standards of the era, genuinely cosmopolitan, a small city's worth of entertainment packed into a single mile of oceanfront. There's a detail worth planting here too, one that will matter much later in this story. In 1955, an artist painted a mural on the side of the Palace Amusements building, a grinning, wide-eyed cartoon face, borrowed in spirit from a similar mascot that had appeared decades earlier at Coney Island. Nobody thought much of it at the time. It was decoration, a bit of whimsy on the side of an arcade wall. Locals started calling it Tilly. For now, it was simply part of the scenery. It would not stay that way. Chapter 3. A second Asbury Park. Behind the postcard version of Asbury Park's boardwalk, there was another town entirely, separated by a set of railroad tracks and by the hard racial lines of the era. This wasn't unique to Asbury Park by any means. This same pattern repeated up and down the Jersey Shore and across countless American resort towns of the period, but it shaped this particular city's future in ways that would echo for the next 100 years. Asbury Park's west side, home to much of the city's black population, existed largely apart from the boardwalk economy that made the town famous. Housing, schools, and public accommodations were segregated, formally or informally, for decades. And yet, out of that segregated west side grew something genuinely remarkable, a thriving nightclub and jazz scene, drawing some of the biggest names in American music. Count Basie and Ella Fitzgerald both played West Side clubs in Asbury Park, at a time when the boardwalk a few blocks away remained largely closed to black visitors and performers alike. This wasn't a footnote to Asbury Park's story. It was, in its own right, a second Asbury Park, running on its own economy, its own culture, its own nightlife, largely invisible to the tourists filling the boardwalk's hotels and arcades. The two economies existed side by side for decades, technically sharing a city limit, but functionally separated by lines that were rarely crossed in either direction. Springwood Avenue, the main commercial corridor running through the west side, became the beating heart of this second economy. Grocers, barbershops, clubs, and churches, all serving a community that the boardwalk's promotional postcards never once pictured. The historical irony here is worth sitting with. The same tourism economy that depended on Bradley's strict exclusionary vision of respectability also depended in practice on black labor. Many of the workers staffing the boardwalk's hotels, restaurants, and shops during the summer season were residents of the West Side, commuting daily across those same railroad tracks to serve a tourist economy that, outside of working hours, offered them little welcome, and even less investment in return. It's important to be direct about this, the same way we've been direct about the racial dimensions of Gary's history and the segregation underlying the Catskills resort economy. Asbury Park's prosperity in this era wasn't shared prosperity. And the tensions built into that arrangement, economic frustration, limited opportunity, a lack of investment in West Side infrastructure, didn't disappear on their own. They accumulated year after year, waiting for a spark. Chapter 4. Peak Season. By the middle of the 20th century, Asbury Park had become one of the most successful resort towns on the entire Jersey Shore. In the summer months, the town's population, which sat around 17,000 year-round, swelled to as many as 80,000 people. As vacationers poured in from New York and Philadelphia to fill the hotels, walk the boardwalk, and spend their money in the arcades and restaurants that lined Ocean Avenue and Kingsley Street, a ratio of visitors to residents that would have been almost unimaginable in most American towns of the era. Convention Hall hosted concerts and civic events that drew crowds from across the region. The casino anchored the southern boardwalk. Palace Amusements, with Tilly now grinning down from its exterior wall, was a genuine landmark, recognized instantly by anyone who'd ever spent a summer at the Jersey Shore. If you had walked this boardwalk on a summer Saturday in the 1950s, you would have seen a town at the absolute height of its power. Crowded beaches, packed hotels, a boardwalk economy that seemed, by every visible measure, built to last indefinitely. Vendors sold saltwater taffy and fried seafood. Bands played from the pavilion Bradley had built decades earlier. Families who had been coming to Asbury Park for 2 or 3 generations by this point had their own regular hotels, their own favorite restaurants, their own rituals built around a week or 2 at the Jersey Shore every summer. But the same forces that were quietly working against industrial cities like Youngstown and Gary during these exact years were also working against Asbury Park, just wearing a different disguise. In 1947, the Garden State Parkway opened, giving New York and New Jersey families a fast, direct route to beaches further south and further from the city's older, established resort towns. Families who had once taken the train specifically to Asbury Park now had dozens of competing beach towns within easy driving distance. The town's advantage, easy accessibility from the city, was quietly becoming less unique with every mile of new highway built. It's a pattern worth naming directly because it recurs across nearly every American town this kind of story gets told about. The very infrastructure that seems in the moment like unrelated progress, a new highway, a new bridge, a faster route somewhere else, often turns out decades later to have been the first quiet crack in an economy that looked, from the inside, completely unshakable. Chapter 5: 4 Days in July. The tension that had been building for decades on Asbury Park's west side broke open on the 4th of July 1970. It started small, a gathering of young people outside a West Side community center, following a late dance, grew unruly. Bottles and rocks were thrown at passing cars and at each other. Police responded, and their intervention, rather than calming the crowd, seemed to escalate it further, with the arrival of just a couple of officers doing little to restore order and much to inflame an already tense situation. Within hours, what had started as sporadic unrest turned into sustained rioting along Springwood Avenue, the central commercial corridor for Asbury Park's Black community. Over the following days, the West Side's business district was hit by fires, looting, and widespread property destruction. Local leaders, including the president of the local NAACP chapter, pointed directly to the underlying causes: a lack of jobs, a housing situation worsened by a decade of urban renewal that had left vacant lots standing unaddressed, and a community that felt correctly that city leadership cared more about protecting boardwalk revenue than addressing conditions on the West Side. One local minister told the press directly that political leaders were interested primarily in the boardwalk, the city's main source of revenue, and had little genuine concern for the West Side, even as he urged young people toward legitimate political channels rather than continued unrest. By the time order was restored, more than 180 people had been injured, including 15 New Jersey state troopers, many of the injuries caused by shotgun pellets fired by police and state troopers attempting to control the crowds. 167 arrests had been made. Property damage was estimated at over $5.5 million, with cleanup costs adding well over $1 million more on top of that. The mayor declared a state of emergency, imposed a curfew running from 8:30 in the evening until 6 the next morning, and called in the New Jersey National Guard to help restore order. This was Asbury Park's Black Monday, its single datable rupture. And like Youngstown's Black Monday, it didn't happen in isolation. It was the visible eruption of tensions that had been building for decades, tensions the boardwalk's postcard image had always managed to keep just out of frame. Chapter 6: The Empire Empties Out. The riot's aftermath hit Asbury Park immediately and did not let up for years. The entire West Side business district was left in ruins, its buildings burned or boarded, its storefronts empty. Middle-class families on the east side, the boardwalk side of town, began leaving in real numbers, unsettled by the violence and by a wider sense that the town's fortunes had shifted. Property values across the city began sliding, a decline that would continue, in various forms, for decades. The riot alone doesn't explain everything that followed, though. Asbury Park's boardwalk economy was already under pressure from forces that had nothing to do with race or unrest. The Garden State Parkway had already begun pulling visitors toward newer beach towns. In 1960, the Monmouth Mall opened just 10 miles away in Eatontown, giving shoppers an air-conditioned modern alternative to Asbury Park's aging downtown storefronts, and pulling professionals, accountants, dentists, lawyers out of downtown office space and into newer developments elsewhere, taking their foot traffic and their tax dollars with them. And in 1974, Six Flags Great Adventure opened in nearby Jackson Township, an enormous modern theme park with roller coasters and attractions that made Asbury Park's mile of boardwalk amusements look, by comparison, like a relic of an earlier era. All steel and thrill rides against a boardwalk, still running rides that had barely changed since the 1940s. Each of these developments, on its own, might have been survivable. A resilient downtown could likely have absorbed the mall, or the theme park, or even the slow bleed of families choosing other beach towns for their summer vacations. What Asbury Park couldn't absorb was all of it happening at once, stacked directly on top of a riot that had already driven out much of its middle-class tax base and devastated its most vulnerable neighborhood in the same handful of years. It's the same lesson we've seen play out in different forms across Youngstown and Gary. It's rarely a single cause that destroys a town this size. It's several causes arriving close enough together that no single one of them ever gets the recovery time it would need on its own. Then came a detail that rarely makes it into the standard version of the story, but deserves real attention. In the mid-1970s, New Jersey began closing a number of its state mental hospitals, part of a broader national push toward deinstitutionalization that was happening in states across the country. Thousands of former patients were released with limited support and few housing options. Many ended up in the cheapest available lodging in the state's most economically vulnerable cities, including the boarding houses and budget motels of a boardwalk town that could no longer fill its once grand hotels with paying summer tourists. A town built on Bradley's vision of wholesome, moral leisure was, within a few years, dealing with an entirely different set of civic challenges it had never been designed to handle, and certainly never budgeted for. By the late 1970s, driving down Ocean Avenue meant passing boarded storefronts, empty lots where businesses once stood, and Victorian houses with peeling paint and broken windows, many of them subdivided into cheap rooming houses for residents with nowhere else to go. The boardwalk that had once rivaled any resort on the Jersey Shore now sat, in long stretches, nearly empty, even in the height of summer. Its amusement rides idle, its hotel windows dark. Chapter 7. The Upstage. Here's the part of Asbury Park's story that makes it different from almost any other declining American resort town. While the boardwalk economy was collapsing in the 1970s, something else was quietly being born in its basements. A club called the Upstage, tucked into a nondescript building just off the boardwalk, became the after-hours gathering place for a loose circle of young musicians in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Unlike the boardwalk's official venues, which closed down for the night at a reasonable hour, the Upstage stayed open until dawn, hosting all-night jam sessions where local musicians could play, experiment, and steal ideas from one another until the sun came up. There was no cover charge to speak of, no real business model beyond keeping the lights on and the amps running. Musicians simply showed up, signed up on a list, and waited their turn to get on stage, sometimes playing alongside people they'd never met until that exact moment, trading licks and songs in a way that felt closer to a nightly workshop than a professional gig. Among the regulars at those all-night sessions was a young guitarist named Bruce Springsteen, still years away from any national recognition, cutting his teeth alongside a rotating cast of local players who would eventually form the core of what became the E Street Band. This wasn't happening in spite of Asbury Park's decline. In a strange way, it was happening because of it. Cheap rent, empty buildings, and a town nobody was watching too closely gave young musicians exactly the kind of low-stakes, low-cost environment where they could experiment for years without anyone expecting much of them or charging them much for the privilege. It's worth sitting with the contrast directly, the way we'd sit with any of the sharpest ironies in a story like this. The same empty storefronts and vacant boardwalk buildings that represented one Asbury Park's economic collapse were, at the very same time, providing the physical space for an entirely different Asbury Park to take shape, one built on music instead of tourism, on culture instead of commerce. Two towns occupying the same square mile at the exact same moment, largely unaware of each other. The families who'd once vacationed here in the 1950s would barely have recognized the town described in this chapter. The musicians building something new here in the early 1970s were, in a very real sense, working in the ruins of a completely different Asbury Park, one that had already come and gone before most of them were born. By 1974, a new club called the Stone Pony opened directly on the boardwalk itself, and it would go on to become the most iconic venue in the entire story, the place most closely associated with Springsteen's rise and with the broader Jersey Shore sound that grew up around him. It, too, opened at a moment when much of the surrounding boardwalk sat dark and half-empty, a single lit doorway in a stretch of buildings that had largely gone quiet. Chapter 8. What was left standing. Through the late 1970s and into the 1980s, Asbury Park's boardwalk landmarks followed the same trajectory as its population and its tax base, a long, slow decline toward ruin. Convention Hall and the casino, once architectural showpieces anchoring either end of the boardwalk, fell into disrepair, used sporadically for events, but never maintained at anything close to their original standard. Roof leaks went unrepaired for years. Sections of ornate plasterwork crumbled and were never restored. The casino's ornate carousel building, in particular, slipped into a kind of suspended decay, still structurally present but stripped of the life that had once filled it. Its wooden floors warping, its windows broken and boarded rather than replaced. Palace Amusements held on longer than most, but by the late 1980s, the arcade's business had thinned to almost nothing. Its bumper cars sitting idle for entire weekends. Its arcade games unplugged one by one as maintenance costs outpaced revenue. In 1988, it closed its doors for good. Its rides and games silent, its most famous feature, Tilly's grinning mural, still watching over a building that no longer had any visitors to greet. Photographs from this era of Asbury Park's history, block after block of the boardwalk shown in the same weathered gray light, have circulated for decades among urban decay photographers and Jersey Shore historians alike, functioning almost as their own genre of documentation. The casino's collapsed roof, Convention Hall's peeling paint, the palace's dark windows, its arcade games silent under a thickening layer of dust. It's the same kind of documentation that grew up around City Methodist Church in Gary, or the abandoned Idora Park grounds in Youngstown, proof, preserved in photographs, that a place people once thought was permanent had genuinely, visibly come apart. There's something worth noting directly here, a kind of dark irony in how this chapter of Asbury Park's story landed. James Bradley had built this town on a vision of moral order and careful control, a place where nothing was left to chance, and nothing was allowed to run wild. A century later, the same waterfront he'd shaped so deliberately was defined instead by the opposite of everything he'd intended. Abandonment, disorder, buildings nobody was responsible for anymore. The rules had outlived their purpose. What was left behind wasn't vice exactly, the thing Bradley had spent his life trying to keep out. It was just absence, which in its own way turned out to be harder to fix. Chapter 9. The storm in the middle of the comeback. By the early 2000s, the first real signs of a different Asbury Park had begun to appear. New restaurants opened along Cookman Avenue. Renovated storefronts replaced some of the boarded ones. A modest but genuine wave of investment, driven partly by the town's growing reputation as an arts and music destination, and partly by developers who recognized real, undervalued oceanfront real estate when they saw it, started to take hold. It wasn't a smooth or uncontested process. And we'll come back to exactly why in a moment. Redevelopment plans for the waterfront had been proposed, stalled, revised, and proposed again multiple times since the 1980s, with more than one earlier attempt collapsing amid funding problems or disputes between the city and its chosen developers, leaving residents understandably skeptical each time a new plan was announced with fanfare. But by 2012, there was at least real, visible momentum behind the idea that Asbury Park was coming back. Momentum that had taken decades to build and could, in theory, still be lost. Then, on October 29, 2012, Hurricane Sandy made landfall along the New Jersey coast, one of the largest Atlantic storms ever recorded by wind field, its outer bands stretching wide enough to threaten roughly 50 million people across the mid-Atlantic and Northeast. Asbury Park took a direct hit, along with nearly the entire Jersey Shore. Roughly 66,000 square feet of boardwalk sustained serious damage, torn apart by the storm surge, with sections of decking found blocks away from the ocean, thrown onto nearby streets by the sheer force of the water. Businesses along the boardwalk were flooded, their windows blown in by the pressure of the surge. One longtime restaurant owner described watching the ocean pour directly through her floor-to-ceiling windows, carrying sand, glass, and debris across the entire dining room, destroying months of work and inventory in a matter of minutes. Just south of Asbury Park, in towns like Seaside Heights, Sandy's damage was even more catastrophic and far more widely photographed. An entire amusement pier's roller coaster left sitting in the ocean, an image that became one of the defining photographs of the entire storm, reproduced in newspapers and news broadcasts across the country for weeks afterward. Asbury Park's damage, while genuinely serious, was not on that same scale, and it's worth being precise about that rather than overstating it for dramatic effect. This was a costly, painful setback to a recovery still finding its footing, not a total destruction of what had been rebuilt so far. It would take months and millions of dollars in federal disaster funding to repair the damage. A local radio interview conducted just after the storm captured something important about how residents understood what had happened. One local business figure, reflecting on the destruction, made the point plainly. Asbury Park had already lived through far worse than a single storm. The town had survived what he called an economic depression, years of being a genuine ghost town, and whatever Sandy had done to the boardwalk, it wasn't going to be the thing that defined this place going forward. He acknowledged the real heartbreak the storm had caused to business owners and to the wider community, but insisted that anyone who actually knew Asbury Park's history understood that this town had already proven, more than once, that it could absorb a hit like this and keep going. That perspective turned out to be accurate. Asbury Park's boardwalk, while seriously damaged, was rebuilt within the following year, aided by a federal grant covering roughly 90% of the reconstruction cost. Sandy was a genuine, costly setback, landing at a moment when the town's comeback was still fragile and unproven. But it turned out to be a test the recovery survived, rather than a blow that ended it. And in a strange way, it reinforced the same lesson Asbury Park had already been teaching over and over for 50 years. This was a town that had learned, out of necessity, how to keep rebuilding. Chapter 10. Palace Amusements comes down. While the boardwalk was slowly finding new life in the early 2000s, one of its oldest landmarks was reaching the end of the line. Palace Amusements, closed since 1988, had sat empty and deteriorating for over 15 years by the time redevelopment plans for the waterfront began moving forward in earnest. Its once grinning facade now streaked and faded, its interior stripped by years of neglect and, in some cases, vandalism. In 2004, an independent structural inspection found the building unsafe, damaged beyond reasonable repair in several areas. City officials ordered its demolition. That decision set off a genuine grassroots campaign to save at least some piece of the building before the wrecking crews arrived. A local preservation group organized quickly, and over a few days in June of 2004, volunteers worked to carefully remove Tilly's mural from the condemned building's exterior wall, along with several other artifacts, including painted images of the old bumper cars, before demolition crews tore the rest of the structure down that July. It was, by most accounts, a genuinely emotional effort. Longtime residents and Springsteen fans alike showing up to watch or assist as pieces of the building that had shaped so many childhood summers were carefully cut away and carried off for safekeeping. The developers who took over the waterfront site made a specific promise in exchange for the valuable rights they were granted. Tilly and the other rescued artifacts would be preserved and incorporated into whatever new building eventually rose on the site. That was the deal. It was explicit, it was public, and it was part of the negotiated terms that allowed the redevelopment to move forward with the state's blessing. More than 20 years later, that promise remains unfulfilled. Tilly's mural, along with the other salvaged pieces, has spent the years since sitting in a fenced storage area outside Convention Hall, inspected periodically, showing real signs of deterioration, according to conservationists who've examined it multiple times over the past 2 decades. No permanent building incorporating the artifacts has ever been completed. Preservation advocates have continued pushing for a resolution, at one point appealing directly to the state's governor to set a firm deadline before he left office, specifically citing how much these artifacts mean not just to Springsteen fans, but to the broader history of the Jersey Shore itself. A replica of Tilly's face now graces the exterior of a nearby live music venue called the Wonder Bar, a kind of stand-in for the original, which remains exactly where we found it at the start of the story, boxed away, waiting for a promise nobody has yet kept. It's a strange, almost fitting arrangement for a town that has spent so much of its history caught between what it once was and what it's still becoming. Chapter 11. Gentrification down the shore. The Asbury Park that exists today is in many ways a genuine success story by the standard measures. Cookman Avenue is lined with restaurants and shops that didn't exist 20 years ago. The boardwalk draws visitors again, many of them young, many of them explicitly drawn by the town's music scene and its reputation as one of the more interesting, less corporate stretches of the Jersey Shore. Real estate listings for Asbury Park properties, once among the cheapest on the entire coast, now regularly draw prices that would have been unthinkable to residents living through the 1980s. A genuine, measurable reversal of decades of decline that nobody living through the town's worst years would have predicted. But that success has raised a real and still unresolved question among longtime residents, particularly those connected to the West Side community, whose neighborhood bore the brunt of the 1970 riots' aftermath and decades of disinvestment that followed. As property values rise along the waterfront and in nearby neighborhoods, longtime residents, many of them the same families who stayed through the town's hardest decades, when leaving simply wasn't an option, have raised genuine concerns about displacement, rising rents, rising property taxes, and a redevelopment process that has, by most accounts, benefited the east side of town far more visibly and far more quickly than the west side ever has. This isn't a question with a clean answer, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. Local researchers and community advocates have documented these concerns directly, describing a pattern in which new investment and media attention cluster around the downtown and beachfront, while the same West Side neighborhoods that suffered the deepest and longest decline continue to wait for a comparable level of reinvestment, decades after the riot that first exposed how unevenly this town's prosperity had always been distributed. Some longtime West Side residents describe watching their own property tax bills climb alongside the town's rising reputation, without a corresponding rise in their own household income or invisible investment on their own block. Asbury Park's comeback is real. Whether it's a comeback for the whole city or mainly for the half of it that was always closer to the ocean, remains a genuinely open argument among the people who actually live there, one that echoes, in a quieter way, the same divide that erupted so violently back in 1970. Chapter 12. Asbury Park today. Asbury Park's year-round population today sits at roughly 15,000 people, still below where it stood in the years just before the 1970 riot, and well below the 80,000 that used to pack these streets every summer weekend at the town's peak. That number alone tells you this is not a story with a simple, complete recovery at the end of it. But the town today is undeniably alive in a way it wasn't for most of the 1980s and 90s. Convention Hall has been partially restored and hosts concerts again, its once crumbling interior now drawing touring acts and local events alike. Music festivals, including an annual event called See Here Now, draw large crowds to the beachfront each year, a direct descendant of the upstage-era music culture that first took root here decades ago. In the empty basements of a town nobody was watching. The Stone Pony, the club most closely associated with Bruce Springsteen's rise, remains open on the boardwalk, still hosting live music most nights of the week. A genuine living piece of the very history this whole story has been tracing. Not a museum piece behind glass, but a working venue that still books new bands every week. Even the food carries some of that same continuity. A diner that opened in 1960, decades before Asbury Park's revival, still serves customers today, its booths having outlasted riots, recessions, a hurricane, and multiple waves of redevelopment plans that never came to anything. It's the kind of small, stubborn survival that doesn't make headlines, but tells you something true about a town like this. Some things simply refuse to leave, even when almost everything around them did. Asbury Park never really recovered the way a town recovers from a single collapse. It spent most of the last 100 years being two places at once, a moral experiment and a music scene, a boardwalk empire and a segregated city, a comeback story, and an unfinished argument about who that comeback is actually for. That pattern hasn't ended. It's just still being written, one summer at a time. If you're from Jersey or you've ever spent a summer on this boardwalk, I want to know, which Asbury Park do you remember? Were you there for the Stone Pony in its early days, catching a band nobody had heard of yet? Did you grow up hearing your parents talk about the boardwalk before 1970? Back when it was still the town everyone drove to? Or is your Asbury Park the one that exists right now, somewhere between the ruins and the revival? Whatever it is, drop it in the comments. A memory of Convention Hall, a night at the Pony, a story about what this town looked like before it started coming back. This channel exists to get these stories right, and nobody tells them better than the people who actually lived them.